All right, good morning everybody again. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. I got to tell you, what a beautiful day to be here. Last year was a little drizzly, a little overcast, and what a perfect Pacific Northwest day to honor Douglas Munro. And good morning. Welcome to the annual Wreath laying and remembrance ceremony for Signalman First Class Douglas A. Munro, the Coast Guard's only Medal of Honor recipient. I'm Master Chief Shane Carroll, the District 13 CMC, and I'm honored to be here today. As our special guest today, I want to extend a warm welcome to the Sheehan family. Thank you for being here and helping to honor your incredible family. Douglas Munro was 22 years old when he gave the ultimate sacrifice on Guadalcanal in 1942. His mother, Edith Munro, served as a lieutenant in the Coast Guard during World War II and is buried here at the cemetery next to her husband, James Munro. They had two children, Douglas Munro and Patricia Sheehan. Patricia's ashes are also buried here near her mother and brother. Patricia had two sons, Chris and Doug, who are both here with their families. Doug Sheehan is a retired commander in the United States Coast Guard Reserves.
Wow.
And is absolutely. And is married to his wonderful wife, Sue. Their son, Patrick, has been coming to this ceremony for many years. Their daughter, Julia, was a sponsor for the Coast Guard's newest national security cutter, the Coast Guard Cutter Munro, that was commissioned in Seattle in 2017. Chris Sheehan is here today with his wife, Diane. Julie's son is Luke Douglas Suarez, carrying on the tradition of including Douglas Munro's name in the members of the family. The Coast Guard is delighted to have such a wonderful support from the family of Douglas Munro. Thank you all for joining us. We are truly grateful for your attendance. We're honored to have the following distinguished guests attending today's memorial. The Honorable Jay McGowan, Mayor of Cle Elum. The Honorable Jim DeVray, the Mayor of the City of South Cle Elum. The 14th Master Chief Petty of the Coast Guard, Heath Jones. 13th District Commander, Real Mobile Buvalis. Captain Patrick Hilbert, Commander, U.S. Coast Guard, Sector Puget Sound. The 11th Master Chief Petty of the Coast Guard, Michael Levitt, retired, along with his wife, Debbie. Commander Fred Talerco and the members of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, Douglas Munro, Robert H. Brooks, Post 1373. This year's Douglas Munro Inspirational Leadership Award recipient, Petty Officer First Class Machinery Technician, Brian Beck. And we have a member of the Grace Generation here with us today. A World War II vet from the United States Marine Corps, Barbara Schauder. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the national anthem and the presentation of colors. Military personnel, attention. And salute.
Mark time. Mark. Detail. Halt.
Post the colors.
Detail. Left pinwheel. Marked. Help. 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 Forward. Mark. Help. 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 Help.
Ready, 2. Now, Chaplain Stephen Valtice, 13th District Chaplain, will deliver the invocation.
Morning. Let us pray together. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we praise you for this glorious day, and we seek your presence here this morning on these hallowed grounds and in the midst of so much beauty. Father, today we remember and honor real courage in action and pay respect to one who embodied devotion to duty. Lord, just as you would call Joshua to be strong and courageous, so you call each of us. And to that end, we remember the courageous sacrifice of one of our own, Signalman First Class Douglas Munro. It is his valor, selfless courage, and love for fellow servicemen that we honor today. His bravery ensured that the Marines were evacuated from the battle-scarred beaches of Guadalcanal. Lord, this young man demonstrated to the world your scripture, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And so today we remember that sacrifice. As we pause now to reflect upon and honor his life, we pray that we fully grasp the reality that is not simply the number of years that we are given here on this earth, but how we live out our lives that truly makes the difference. So grant to each one of us in the Coast Guard, the Marines, and other services, or however we may be serving our great nation, this same heart and spirit, and to understand that by loving, by giving, by sacrificing, it is then that we truly receive your greatest blessings in life. We say these things in the most precious name, your holy name of Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Chaplain. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Military personnel at ease. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce Mr. Doug Sheehan. Doug Sheehan was born 5 years after Douglas Munro died and was named after his late uncle. Following in his uncle's footsteps, Doug joined the Coast Guard from the Coast Guard Candidate School in 1969, serving 3 years of active duty and 17 years in the Coast Guard Reserves, retiring as a commander in 1990. He served on a buoy tender and was the commanding officer of 2 Coast Guard Reserve units. He enjoyed having the opportunity to attend ceremonies, honoring his uncle and the Coast Guard throughout the past 60 years. His daughter Julia was a sponsor for the recently commissioned Coast Guard Cutter Munro. He and his wife Sue have been married for 51 years and have 2 children, Patrick and Julie. Mr. Doug Sheehan.
Morning. I'd like to start by thanking the Marines. They do such a great job for us every year. We wanted to have Lieutenant Colonel Etsy as our speaker this year, one of our speakers, but he had a ton of conference today, and we hope to have him next year. I want to thank the VFW, certainly. Without you, we probably wouldn't be here. All the people from Cle Elum, South Cle Elum, Roslyn, thanks to Master Chief Jones, Admiral Rublis, and all of our Coast Guard friends and family. There's kind of an unwritten rule in the Coast Guard that an officer is not supposed to take the limelight away from the enlisted people whenever there's an event honoring Douglas Munro. The ceremony really started in 1999 when everyone learned that Mike Cooley, in charge of the VFW post here, had raised and lowered the flag here for 40 years. The Chief Petty Officers Association of Seattle, the VFW, the City of Cle Elum, they all said, we have to do something. So they started to raise money, and they installed the flagpole, which you see here, and the memorial, and certainly the light, which you may not be as aware that he is here. Master Chief Vince Patton was here at the ceremony. He was the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard at the time. the Clayellum schools let the kids out of school, and so so they could attend the ceremony, and we had about 700 people here. It was just amazing to see that many people. I was casually talking to Admiral Paul Blaney, who was the 13th District Commander at the time, and he said when he heard about this wonderful ceremony, he did what he always does. He assigned a junior officer as the project officer for this ceremony. And the next day, 5 chief petty officers walked into his office and said, "Admiral, I appreciate all the support that you've given us, but would you please butt out? This is our ceremony." So he had to tell his project officer to stand down, and the Seattle Enlisted Association and the Seattle Chief Petty Officers Association have been in charge of this ceremony ever since. I don't want you to think that Douglas Munro is not important to officers, because that's certainly not the case. I always feel really great to see how many officers attend this ceremony every year. You might think it seems a little odd to have an admiral here, but he's not the keynote speaker. You've probably never seen that before. When I was on active duty about 1,000 years ago, I think the relationship between officers and enlisted people was a little more tenuous and strained than it is today. The general perception was that officers gave orders and everyone else followed them. Sometimes that's necessary, but not always. I have to tell you a story that illustrates this point, because it's one of my favorite stories. And it illustrates how our hierarchical top-down structure in the military, it works, and sometimes it's very necessary. So when Admiral Papp was our commandant many years ago, he was visiting the Coast Guard Academy, and he was speaking to a room full of people, and he said, "We need to have a course in Coast Guard history, and it needs to be taught for credit here at the Academy. It needs to be a requirement for graduation." You may find it hard to believe there was no such course at the time. One of the people in the audience said, "Admiral, that is a fabulous idea. I support it wholeheartedly. I just want to advise you that it may be kind of difficult to get that course implemented in the fall. We have a very complicated curriculum structure, and very hard to change, and we have to get the materials ready for all of this sort of thing, and the right instructor, and then we have to have a review process to make sure all of our regulations from Congress are still going to support this and everything. And so it takes some time." Admiral Papp looked at him and he says, "I don't think you heard me correctly. There will be a Coast Guard history class taught in the fall." And I believe that if Admiral Papp hadn't done that, we still might not have a Coast Guard history class taught in the Academy. You know, in my active duty years, we didn't have a role for the command senior enlisted advisor. And if you're not in the military, haven't been in the military, you may not be familiar with that role. Every commanding officer in the Coast Guard has one of his people, one of his enlisted people, as his senior enlisted advisor. And that concept applies all the way up to the Commandant of the Coast Guard. It applies to the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, Master Chief Keith Jones, who's here with us today. The job of that senior enlisted advisor is to be able to speak to the commanding officer directly about any issue he thinks is important, particularly if it applies to the quality of life of our enlisted people. Our service often places very difficult strain on the families of our people. Typical issues include housing, pay, morale, personnel things, and all of these have a significant impact on our ability to perform our missions and to retain our people. It's kind of too easy for the commanding officer to focus on the many things he has to do, like focus on the mission, administration, logistics, and he or she doesn't always see what it's really like to live as an enlisted person and one of their family So the senior enlisted advisor has to make sure that important issues like this are raised to the commanding officer directly without any filters. And I believe having that position has created great dividends to our organization by helping everyone feel like they're a part of the team. Now, I've known several Master Chief Petty Officers of the Coast Guard over the years, and I treasure my relationships with all of them. I feel like I have a little bit of a foot in both camps. It's great to have Master Chief Heath Jones with us here today, in particular, an honor for me, because I look forward to a great relationship with him for years to come. Now, to further illustrate the importance of this job, I would say that Russia will not win the war in Ukraine. And I think that's because they don't really have a concept like the senior enlisted advisor. It's because I don't believe they really care about their people that much. President Putin seems to think that he can draft 300,000 people, put them on the battlefield, and expect some kind of a miracle. He seems to have subscribed to that old concept that a body is a body is a body. That has never been true, and it never will be true. One time I was at the Coast Guard Academy on Hopley-Eaton Day. Hopley-Eaton was the first Coast Guard commissioned officer. I can remember feeling that the officers seemed to feel like Hopley-Eaton was our guy, and the enlisted people kind of felt like Douglas Munro was our guy. I like to think that this ceremony has done a lot to break down an us versus them kind of a concept, and it's led to better cooperation and teamwork in the Coast Guard. I think my uncle would be very pleased to see this kind of change in perception. When he returned from landing the Marines on Guadalcanal, he got back to his base, his commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Dexter, told him that the Marines were trapped and needed to be evacuated, and if they weren't evacuated, they'd all be killed. So he needed volunteers to do the job. Everyone volunteered. It wasn't like an officer gave an order and everyone followed it. Everyone just understood and focused on what had to be done. And I like to think that we value that kind of teamwork in the Coast Guard today. So I encourage you to think of that day and think about how all of us have a role to play in every Coast Guard event.
Thank you, Commander Sheehan. In fact, I have a bio and discussion about what the Master Chief Petty of the Coast Guard does, and I think you summed that up perfectly. So I'm going to just go ahead and introduce Master Chief Petty of the Coast Guard, Heath Jones, to the podium.
Shane, thank you for not reading a bio. That's Admiral can tell you. You hate sitting there when people, it makes you feel old as they sit there and go through the bio. And the longer they read, you're like, the older I feel. Thank you, Shane, for that introduction. Thank you, Doug, for the opportunity to join your family here and honoring your late uncle. It's my privilege to join you all in reflecting the legacy of your uncle, Signalman First Class Douglas Munro. You know, upon coming to the job, or finding out I was coming to the job early last spring, this was one of the first invites I was waiting for us to go through. And as I was telling Doug earlier, you know, I've never had the privilege of coming up and making this event. I've always wanted to, and we kind of took a tiered approach to things, knowing we couldn't say yes to everything, but this is the one that was cemented, put in stone, written down, said the entire schedule builds around being in Cle Elum on September 27th. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you very much, Shane. You introduced all the distinguished guests, and I'll just say let's let all standing greetings and salutations remain in effect. But a couple of people I did want to specifically call out. Admiral Bublis, thank you, sir. Thank you for bringing in a backseat hitter for this and allowing me to speak. I truly appreciate that. You know, the best thing about our Coast Guard is, you know, other than our women and men, is just as busy as we are spread out across the world. We're a small family, and we all have ties. Our ties go back to the D8 days. We didn't really get to overlap there, but I know the best part of Admiral Bublis is he's got a Louisiana wife, and that's wonderful. As do I. It's great to see our 11th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, Mike 11, his wonderful wife Debbie. You know, I can honestly say that Mike has been an inspiration, a mentor, and a friend to me literally my entire career. He was the XPO on my first unit in the Coast Guard in Palm Bluff, Arkansas on the canal. So great to see you here, Mike. Thank you so much. And to Brian and Jesse, thank y'all for being here, who are in Pensacola, Florida now, which is another place where Carol and I have served near and dear to our heart. Congratulations to you. It is no small feat to earn the award that you did, and I know you're very proud, Jesse. Thank you all for being here. When we reflect on Signalman First Class Douglas Munro, we envision the iconic black and white photo, and everybody's seen this one. It's where he's got the white Dixie cup at the slight tilt resting atop his head, and it's just an unmistakable youth that will forever be ingrained in our minds with him. And as I'm walking through, if you walk through Coast Guard headquarters, there's memorabilia everywhere. I mean, it really is a museum in and of itself. But in our ceremonial entrance, there's the bust of your uncle, and that's the one. And I pass through there quite a bit these days. I stop every single time and take a look at that one, just because if it doesn't inspire you to go work hard for our workforce, then nothing will. So it's truly remarkable. He was just barely in his 20s. Grew up not far from here, and he chose to leave behind his love of music and his family and enlist in the military along with thousands of other young women and men who answered the call to serve their nation at that time. Americans of all faiths, races, and ethnicities sailed across oceans and joined allies in a desperate fight for liberty. And it was because of our life-saving mission that Douglas Munro was drawn to serve in our United States Coast Guard. And according to his dear friend and fellow signalman Raymond Evans, Douglas Munro was vital, outgoing, liked everybody he met, and seems like everyone that met him truly liked him. He was described as fun to be around and a very hard worker, and he embodied the drive and determination to be proficient in his rating as a Coast Guard signalman. And in 1941, he volunteered for the mission aboard the U.S. Navy attack transports, and they were short on signalmen. He quickly demonstrated his desire to serve and to save. Rising through the ranks as a signalman, he deployed with the Navy to embark on the first major amphibious assault of the war in the Pacific at Guadalcanal. The Navy was significantly undermanned in boat drivers, so the two young Coast Guardsmen, Douglas Munro and Raymond Evans, saw this as an opportunity and volunteered to help augment those shortages. As a legacy, my rating is a boatmate, so we're a seagoing rating as well. And I wonder what it's like for him to have put himself in harm's way, didn't think about his safety, didn't think about anything other than that's the mission that needs to be done, that's the mission where I can help, and he put himself out there, volunteered to do it. In just a few short weeks, he received the training for the new assignment. There were going to be coxswains on the Higgins boats. The 36-foot wooden craft were used to fulfill one of the most important roles during the war, which is getting the Marines ashore to fight in Guadalcanal. These brave young men moved out in droves, and they were assigned with the mission to transport the Marines during the Japanese assault at Luna Point. As they approached the shore, they could feel the humidity on their skin, the air was thick, malaria-carrying mosquitoes were a constant threat. They could see the sprawling rainforest on the coast and lined with palm trees. And what they probably assumed but weren't positive at that time was that what they couldn't see cloaked was the enemy forces waiting on them to arrive. And when word came in that the Marines that they had transported to the island were under attack and needed to be saved, the 22-year-old signalman Douglas Munro, from the stories that I hear, when they said, "We need you to go back in and save them," his response was a simple, "Hell yes." Think about that. Did not pause for concern, did not pause to think. He simply looked and said, "Hell yes." He and Evans led 10 boat crews to shore where they were met with intense enemy fire, but it never deterred them from executing their mission and rescuing the 500 Marines that were saved because of their actions that day. And it was in that moment during the recovery of the final men from the beach when Douglas Munro met his fate. He simply chose to put service before himself. He chose to do the right thing at the right time for the right reason. And he did it so that others may live. Signalman First Class Douglas Munro gallantly gave up his life in defense of his country, saving hundreds of embattled Marines. He was among the more than 7,100 Americans who lost their lives at Guadalcanal campaign. And yet, even in his final moments, he didn't think of himself. All he thought about were the Marines and the mission at hand. And as everyone knows, the annals of history say the last words that came out of his mouth were, "Did we get them off?" Think about that. That's powerful. More than 80 years later, Douglas Munro's legacy lives on in our Coast Guard every single day. He is remembered and honored by every member of the Coast Guard for his altruistic devotion to duty and heroism. Not only our Coast Guard, he is a revered and honored and remembered in the history of the United States Marine Corps as well. Douglas Munro has become an inspiration for so many who have served in the Coast Guard for his sacrifice. We're each shaped by the events of our time, and I say that knowing today the hardships and sacrifices that are continued to be made every day by the brave women and men serving in uniform, his service legacy taught us that even as we ask so much for our workforce, they always answer the call, and they answer the call because of leaders and legends like Douglas Munro. Throughout his leadership, guidance, and action, Douglas Munro ultimately strengthened the unity between the Coast Guard and the Marine Corps. For his heroic actions and sacrifice, at the time, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chesty Bullard, another revered United States Marine, recommended that Douglas Munro be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He remains to this day the only Coast Guard recipient of the Medal of Honor. And he is also the only non-Marine to have his name enshrined in the Hall of Heroes at the Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia. Our soldiers, sailors, Marine, airmen, guardians, and Coast Guardsmen are serving around the world today, ready to answer the call, just like Douglas Munro did 80 years ago. Every day, our brave workforce demonstrates resiliency, and without hesitation, they're willing to put their life on the line to accomplish the missions of our nation. The lessons we learn while serving in the military from generation to generation remain the same: discipline, responsibility, humility, and loyalty. Recently, Emma Fagan and I were in Key West meeting with our fast response cutter crews down there, and they've been underway day and night in response to the mass migration at sea as part of Operation Vigilant Shield. Their resiliency, adaptability, and devotion has enabled this critical life-saving mission. And I went down there hoping to see that where they were kind of, how they were drawing their strength and where they were drawing their strength from. And it was during the time talking to one of the BM2s off of the Coast Guard cutter Raymond Evans, oddly or not, that your uncle's name, Doug, was brought up. And their thought down there is if he could do what he did, we can still do what we do down there every day. So I still thank you for your uncle's legacy that he did. Raymond Evans carried his story in the time, and he told and said that throughout Coast Guard history and Marines, he wanted to ensure that your uncle's story was told. We honor him today on our halls, our hulls, and in our history. His story has stood the test of time for the last 80 years. And as years pass by, we continue to lose more members from the greatest generation. It remains within all of us to uphold Douglas Munro's legacy by ensuring the events that happened on September 27, 1942 are continued to be shared, told, never fade, and we continue to speak his name and honor. Over the last 80 years, the Coast Guard has upheld Raymond Evans' request to ensure that there always remains a Munro in the Coast Guard fleet honoring your uncle's true legacy. We've carried the namesake of Douglas Munro to include the Douglas Munro Inspirational Leadership Award, honoring those who demonstrate exemplary leadership, naming a 378-foot high endurance cutter after him, a national security cutter, our Coast Guard headquarters building, facilities at Training Center Cape May, and at the United States Coast Guard Academy. This helps us ensure that every single member that dons the uniform of the United States Coast Guard leaves their accession point knowing the name Douglas Munro. These enduring symbols define our history, heritages, and tradition, honoring our past by serving the present. Signalman First Class Douglas Munro's legacy inspires us in our efforts to uphold the freedoms and values for which he so nobly fought. And even before they came into play, it was years later that we adopted our Coast Guard core values of honor, respect, and devotion and duty. But your uncle lived every day. He was honorable, he was respected, he was devoted. And he truly led the way for our core values that we instilled today. So thank you very much for letting me join you today. Semper Fidelis, Semper Paratus, and God bless.
Thank you, Master Chief Petty Coast Guard Keith Jones. Wreath bearers, please pose for the presentation of the wreath. Chief Petty Officer Ryan DeTorres, representing the Coast Guard Combat Veterans Association. Chief Warrant Officer Larry Goad, representing the Chief Warrant Officers Association. Chief Petty Officer Jake Solis, representing the Chief Petty Officers Association. Intelligence Specialist Second Class, Connor Lipinski, representing the Coast Guard Enlisted Association, and Ensign Sean Conley, representing Puget Sound's Officers Association. Everyone, please stand. During the emplacement of the wreaths, the reading of the Medal of Honor citation, rendering of honors with a rifle platoon, and the playing of taps, followed by a moment of silence. Wreath bearers, please place the wreaths on Signalman First Class Douglas Munro's gravesite. The Medal of Honor was presented to Douglas Munro's parents, Mr. and Mrs. James Munro, by the President Franklin D. Roosevelt in a ceremony at the White House on Thursday, May 27, 1943. The citation reads, awarded posthumously to Douglas Albert Munro, Signalman First Class, United States Coast Guard, for extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in the act above and beyond the call of duty as officer in charge of a group of Higgins boats engaged in the evacuation of a battalion of Marines trapped by enemy Japanese forces at Point Cruz, Guadalcanal on September 27, 1942. After making preliminary plans for the evacuation of nearly 500 trapped Marines, Munro, under constant risk of his life, daringly led 5 of his small craft toward the shore. As he closed the beach, he signaled the others to land, and then, in order to draw enemy fire to protect a heavily loaded boat, he valiantly placed his craft with its 2 small guns as a shield between the beachhead and the Japanese. When the perilous task of evacuating was nearly complete, Munro was killed by enemy fire, but his crew, 2 of whom were wounded, carried on until the last boat had loaded and cleared the beach. By his outstanding leadership, expert planning, and dauntless devotion to duty, he and his courageous comrades undoubtedly saved the lives of many who otherwise would have perished. He gallantly gave up his life in defense of his country. Military personnel, attention. At this time, Marines from Marine Corps Security Force Battalion Bangor will render honors. And salute.
Magazine of blank ammunition. Load. Ready. Hey. Fire. Ready. Hey. Fire. Ready. Hey. Fire. Present. Arm.
Everyone at ease, please. Everyone, please be seated. At this time, I'd now like to ask Master Chief Martinowski, District 14 Command Master Chief, to give a gesture to the Sheehan family.
Thank you, Master Chief. Good morning, everybody. So, Commander, first up, I want to start off. I started off my Coast Guard career rated as a quartermaster. Doesn't exist anymore. Best rating out there, by the way. Back then, signalmen no longer existed in the Coast Guard, and now quartermasters don't exist. But as quartermasters, we took on the rating of signalmen. And so, as a very young SNQM on the cutter, I was the signalman on board the cutter, and I was very proud of it. So back then, I bought myself my little helm, which is the quartermaster's insignia, and I bought crossed signal flags, which is the signalman's, as my little devices. And I had those with me my entire career. Last month, I had the honor of going down to Guadalcanal for the 80th anniversary. And for those who don't know, it's a day and a half, 2 days full of ceremonies at different memorials throughout Guadalcanal and Solomon Islands. And of course, this Munro Memorial is right there at Point Cruz. They always offer us the opportunity, as the Coast Guardsmen. There's only 3 of us. Luckily, we had more coming in on the lead deck. But we have the opportunity to do a ceremony to honor Douglas Munro. And I was honored to MC and be a part of the ceremony. That evening, though, I went back out to the beach. And knowing that I was going down there, I took my signalman insignias with me. And so that night, I took that insignia and I dipped it in the water there at Point Cruz. Because we all know that everything's always better a little salty. And then I took some of the sand. Don't tell anybody about that. And I placed it in a not as nice to bring back to myself. And Master Chief Carroll and I were talking about this, and we wanted to get as many people up here as we possibly could. And I was like, I've never been able to do the ceremony. I've wanted to come. Why not leave Honolulu for a day and come all the way out here? And he thought it'd be important for me to be able to present this to you and your family.
Thank you, Master Chief. Thank you to the Greater Seattle Chief Petty Officers Association for coordinating today's memorial. Special thanks to the VFW Commander, Fred Talrico, of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, arranging this assembly. Thank you to Dale Nitz from the Veterans Museum for setting up the display. Thank you, Mayor McGowan and Mayor DeVries for allowing us to hold this ceremony. Thanks to all the members of the VFW, Douglas Munro, Robert H. Brooks, Post 1373. Thank you to the Sheehan family, and thank you to the Master Chief Petty of the Coast Guard, Heath Jones, for joining us in today's ceremony. Please rise and remain standing for the playing of Semper Paratus. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's ceremony.